So now we have moved on to the motor neuron. And you are going to ask me, Miss Devons, what is a motor neuron? And I am so glad you asked that because now this is the type of nerve cell that carries an impulse from the brain. Now remember, the brain is where those inner neurons are. So they take the impulse from those inner neurons from the brain to the muscle or the gland. So if they're going to the muscle, it's what's allowing you to move your arm or move your leg. If they're going to the gland, okay, everybody do this for me. I want everybody right now to think about something really sweet. A piece of candy, a cookie, maybe your favorite cake or your ice cream. And now how about think about something really, really sour. Do you guys feel the saliva in your mouth starting to secrete? All right, when that secretion happens, that's because you have a muscle neuron interacting with that saliva gland, causing it to release the saliva. So when you think about candy, or you think about a really good cookie you just had, or you want to have, what happens is your brain starts thinking about it and it sends a signal through a motor neuron. So it sends a signal through a motor neuron, and then that motor neuron interacts with either your muscle, or in this case we're thinking about saliva, so it's interacting with your salivary gland, and it's causing that salivary gland to release substances. The substance it's releasing is saliva. So real quickly, if we look at one of these neurons, right here we're looking at, let me erase that. Right here we're looking at one of these neurons. We're looking at a motor neuron here. And what you see is you see the neuron itself, yep, and then you see its little branches, its axon. These are its dendrites. We're going to explain that in a minute. But they reach out and they attach, the ends of theirs attach to a muscle fiber or a gland. And when this electrical impulse is sent down, this axon, that electrical impulse is received by your muscle cells, and remember, these are muscle cells, these are striated muscle, so this is skeletal muscle. So those electrical impulses are received by the skeletal muscle, and it causes your skeletal muscle to contract, which in turn moves your bone, right? So a motor neuron is the type of nerve cell that carries an impulse. Remember, that impulse is in the form of electricity from the brain to a muscle or to a gland. Okay, so we're going to switch back over to adding everything that we talked about onto our big note sheet. So we talked about the neurons, that they were individual nerve cells. And we said they were microscopic. They were very, very, very tiny, tiny, tiny. All right? And then if you put a whole bunch of them together, you got this great big bundle of a nerve, right? And they are very large. They can be very large. They don't have to be, but they can be very large. All right. So what makes up the nerve types that we looked at? Well, we looked at sensory neurons. And sensory neurons are neurons that pick up stimuli from the environment. So let's go ahead and write that down. So these guys pick up stimuli from the environment. Okay, so what do these guys make? Well, they make a sensory nerve. So what do they make? If I put them all together, if I bundle them all together, what do they make? And that would be a sensory nerve. So we have so many sensory nerves, but a really easy one is to talk about the optic nerve. Remember I had Leia and Leah, and Leia was catching the ball I threw. Well, the input that she got from her sensory nerves, her sensory neurons, was this ball coming at her. And then all of that input went into a bundle to form a sensory nerve. And that name, and you don't have to remember that name, but that name is called an optic nerve. You may have heard of that. So the sensory nerve carries the impulse to the brain. So its job, so this is an example, I'm going to put EX here. Okay, so the sensory nerve's job is to carry the impulse. And remember that impulse is in the form of electrical impulse, is to carry the impulse to the brain. So, sensory nerve. An example of a sensory nerve is an optic nerve. And what does it do? Its job is to carry, so I'm going to put job right here. Its job is to carry the impulse to the brain. Let's see if I can make this a little bit neater for you guys to look at. Okay? So the sensory neurons make, and we shouldn't have a question mark there. I should probably erase that question mark. Yep. They make a sensory nerve. And I think I'm going to actually do that in a different color. So I'm sorry, guys. They make a sensory nerve. An example of a sensory nerve would be an optic nerve. And then the job of the sensory nerve is to carry the electrical impulse to your brain. Okay, so after the sensory neurons, we then talked about the interneurons. So if you recall, the interneurons connect other neurons. So the interneurons make up the brain and the spinal cord. And that's a spinal cord. I think you guys see it's C-O-R-D, not C-H-O-R-D. Okay? And then once they're in the brain or the spinal cord, those interneurons have to interpret the signals from the sensory nerves. So they have to figure out what to do next. So they have to interpret the signals. And remember, these signals are in the form of electrical impulses. So they have to interpret the signals from the sensory neurons. So what we have is we have the sensory neurons. They pick up stimuli. They send the stimuli down a sensory nerve. Those sensory nerves then go to the interneurons. And that's going to be in this brain and the spinal cord. And those interneurons interpret the signals that the sensory neurons have sent them. So then after that, after they interpret it, they go to, or they send it to the motor neurons. And I hope I don't run out of room on this little sheet of paper here. We're almost done with this, guys. So they send it to the motor neurons. And remember, they send it in the form of an electrical impulse. And this electrical impulse is going to trigger either the contraction of a muscle or a gland. If it's a muscle that's contracting, it's most likely going to be moving your body. If it's a gland, it can be something causing the secretion of saliva. So it is going to cause, so it's going to trigger, I guess that's a good word for it, trigger the contraction of a muscle, or a gland. And the gland might not contract, it would secrete. Trigger the contraction, and then I'm going to have to put secretion, contraction or secretion of a muscle or gland. Okay, and how do they do that? Well, they do that through motor nerves. Now remember, one neuron, and many of those, that's just one cell, but put a whole bunch of them together and you get a nerve. So a nerve, and it's oh no, Miss Devens, where'd it go? Okay, I better stop this here because I have no idea where my stuff went. Let me see. Nope, let me go find it. Okay guys, sorry. So these motor nerves carry a response from, so what are they carrying the response from? Where are they coming from? They're coming from the brain, right? So they carry a response from the brain to, and where are they going to? To either the muscle or the gland. Excellent, yay. Okay, so now we have finished this section of the notes. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go ahead and take a neuron, and we're going to label a neuron so you guys can know all of the parts to the neurons. So you now know what neurons are. They're individual cells and they're super tiny, whereas if you put them all together, they make one big large nerve. We know that sensory neurons are the ones that respond to stimuli, and they take that stimuli and they transport it. They have that impulse, right, in the form of an electrical signal, and they take it to the brain. Well, in the brain you have all these inner neurons, and inner neurons connect neurons to neurons. They're all friendly, they're holding hands everywhere, they love everybody. But those inner neurons tell the signal, that electrical impulse, they decide where it goes. So they tell it where to go. All right, and then if they tell it where to go, they're telling it to go to some motor neuron. That motor neuron could trigger the contraction or secretion of a muscle or a gland. All right, so those motor neurons carry the response in the form of an electrical impulse from the brain to the muscle or to the gland to have either the release of saliva because you smelt something baking and you really wanted a piece of that fantastic cookie, or maybe you smelt something really sour, and or maybe none of the above. Maybe you wanted to win first place at a track meet, right? So all of those are courtesy of your muscle nerves, your motor nerves. That's my chocolate chip cookie there. Your motor nerves bringing that response from your brain. All right, guys, this part of the notes is done. Yay, good job, class. You guys rock. Okay, so let's go on to the next thing.